To the outside world, it looks like paradise. Browse the marketing brochures or those sweeping drone shots from Lord of the Rings, and New Zealand appears to be the last sanctuary on Earth, a remote, safe, green utopia at the bottom of the world. But is it really? Analyze the raw data, and a very different picture emerges, a portrait of a nation that is quietly bleeding to death. In the last 12 months alone, a net record of over 50,000 citizens packed their bags, sold their furniture, and bought a one-way ticket out. For a population the size of South Carolina, that is a demographic catastrophe. It is the equivalent of the United States losing 3 million people in a single year. We aren't talking about just anyone. We mean its doctors, engineers, builders, and youth. They aren't leaving because of war or political persecution. They are leaving because the math of living here has simply stopped making sense. For decades, this island state positioned itself as the, quote, rock star market of the Pacific. It became a haven for tech billionaires like Peter Thiel and a backup plan for the global elite. But behind the beautiful scenery and the clean image lies a brutal financial reality that has been festering for 20 years. It is a story of property bubbles that defied gravity. Monopolies choked the cost of living, and a productivity crisis turned a first world nation into a low-wage holiday destination for the rest of the globe. To understand why everyone is departing, we have to see past the postcards. We must examine the balance sheet of NZ Inc. When you do, you realize that this isn't just a migration trend. It is a run on the bank. But instead of withdrawing money, the people are withdrawing their future. The story of this exodus begins with a promise. For generations, the quote, two was essentially a modest version of the American ideal. You get a job, you work hard, and you buy a quarter-acre block of land with a standalone home. It was a simple, egalitarian contract. But somewhere around the early 2000s, that agreement was quietly shredded. Walk down the streets of Auckland or Wellington today, and you won't see immediate signs of collapse. The cafes are open, the traffic is moving, the skyline is growing. But talk to anyone under the age of 40, and you will hear the same word repeated over and over again: trapped. According to the International Monetary Fund, these islands host some of the most unaffordable property in the entire world relative to income. Not just expensive, severely unattainable. In the last decade, real estate prices here rose faster than almost any other OECD member. At its peak, the median home price in Auckland was over $1 million, while the median income sat hovering around $60,000. You don't need a PhD in economics to see the disconnect. That is a price-to-income ratio of nearly 10 to 1. For context, historically, a ratio of 3 to 1 is considered fair. But here is the detail that most international observers miss. When property values skyrocket in places like New York or London, it is usually because those cities are global engines with massive salaries to match. Aotearoa achieved New York costs with Alabama wages. How did this happen? It wasn't an accident. It was in many ways the nation's primary business model. For the last 20 years, the local financial system became addicted to the capital gains of real estate. The government, regardless of which party was in power, created tax incentives that made speculating on homes more profitable than starting a business. There is no capital gains tax on the family residence, and for a long time there were massive loopholes for investors. The result was a signal to the market: don't invest in innovation, don't invest in tech, don't invest in manufacturing. Put your money in a wooden box on a piece of dirt and wait. And it worked. On paper, locals felt rich. They used their properties like ATM machines, borrowing against the rising value to buy new cars and go on holidays. It created a wealth effect that powered commerce, but it was a mirage. The place wasn't getting richer, it was just getting more expensive. But remember this, because it becomes crucial later. While the older generation celebrated their rising asset values, the younger generation was being mathematically eliminated from their own homeland. This brings us to the second pillar of the crisis, the cost of living. And I don't just mean inflation, which everyone is dealing with. I mean the structural, baked-in price of existing in this corner of the world. There is a concept in economics called the tyranny of distance. The archipelago is isolated. It is 3 hours by plane to its nearest neighbor, Australia, and 12 hours to anywhere else major. Shipping things here costs money. But distance alone doesn't explain why a block of cheese made locally costs more in a domestic supermarket than it does in London. According to a sweeping investigation by the Commerce Commission, the grocery sector here is one of the most concentrated on Earth. It is a duopoly. 2 major companies control almost the entire market. When you have 2 players, you don't really have competition. You have a comfortable arrangement. They control the supply chain, they control the shelf space, and ultimately, they control the price tag. And it's not just food. Take a view of the construction sector. Everyone agrees the nation needs to build more accommodation to lower prices. So why can't they? Because erecting a structure here costs significantly more than almost anywhere else. A report by the Deloitte firm highlighted that building materials cost up to 30% more than across the Tasman Sea. Why? Because of another virtual monopoly on supplies. Fletcher Building, a massive conglomerate, has historically dominated the supply chain for materials like plasterboard. So, imagine you are a young professional. You are 28 years old. You did everything right. You went to university, you got the degree, you got the job. But you are paying 50% of your income in rent because the accommodation supply is artificially constricted. You go to the supermarket and pay a premium for food that was grown 10 miles down the road. You consider buying a home, and you realize you would need to save for 15 years just to get a deposit. Then, you check your phone. You open Instagram or LinkedIn, and you see your friend who moved to Brisbane or Melbourne or Sydney. They just bought a place. They are earning 30% more for doing the exact same job. They pay less tax. This is the turning point. This is the moment where the decision shifts from quote 0 to quote 1. The relationship between New Zealand and Australia is unique. Under the Trans-Tasman Travel Arrangement, citizens of either state can live and work in the other indefinitely. There are no visas, no green cards, no sponsorship requirements. You just get on a plane, land, and start working. For decades, this was a friendly exchange. But in recent years, it has turned into a vacuum. The larger continent is actively, aggressively poaching Kiwi talent. Think about that for a moment. Imagine if Canada offered every American citizen a 30% raise, cheaper rent, and better healthcare, and all they had to do was drive across the border. How many people would stay in the US out of pure patriotism? The recruitment drive from across the ditch is relentless. State governments there run advertising campaigns in Kiwi cities. They target police officers, nurses, teachers, and construction workers. They put up billboards that literally say, quote, "to," and the numbers are staggering. In the healthcare sector, the situation is critical. A doctor here can move west and instantly increase their salary by $50,000 to $100,000 a year. The working conditions are better, the hospitals are better funded, and the cost of living is often lower. According to stats from the Medical Council, a significant percentage of locally trained doctors eventually leave. The smaller nation is subsidizing the medical education of the larger one, but it's here that we find the hidden mechanic that makes this even worse. It's not just that people are leaving, it's who is leaving. Migration figures are often net numbers, arrivals minus departures. For a long time, the government covered up the exodus of locals by importing record numbers of low-skilled immigrants. They pumped up the population to keep GDP growing. If you bring in 100,000 people who all need to buy fridges and cars and rent apartments, your GDP goes up. But your GDP per capita, the amount of wealth per person, stagnates. This is exactly what happened. The state masked its structural failure with a population Ponzi scheme. They replaced engineers and doctors leaving for Sydney with retail workers and hospitality staff coming from developing nations. There is nothing wrong with those workers, but economically, it creates a productivity death spiral. You are trading high-wage, high-productivity tax revenue for low-wage, low-productivity tax revenue. The result is a crumbling infrastructure. The roads are full of potholes because the tax base can't support the population growth. The hospitals have wait times that run into the years because the specialists have left, but the patient numbers have exploded. The schools are overcrowded. And this brings us to the concept of the quote, 3 Kiwis work hard. In fact, they work some of the longest hours in the OECD, but they generate very little value per hour worked compared to other advanced economies. Why? Because businesses don't invest in technology. Why would a business owner invest $1 million in new machinery to make their workers more efficient? They could just take that $1 million, buy a residential property, and make a tax-free capital gain of 10% a year. The real estate market cannibalized the productive sector. Capital flows to where the returns are easiest. In this jurisdiction, the easiest returns were in land banking, not in innovation. Meanwhile, the government's books are starting to look ugly. During the pandemic, the central bank printed money on a massive scale. The Reserve Bank pumped billions into the system to keep it afloat. But where did that money go? It didn't go into building new factories or tech hubs. It washed straight into the property sector, inflating the bubble even further. Now, the bill is coming due. Interest rates have risen to combat inflation. Suddenly, that mortgage that was just barely affordable at 2% interest is completely impossible at 7%. Homeowners are holding on by their fingernails, cutting back on every other expense. This crashes the retail sector. Shops are closing. Restaurants are empty. It is a domino effect. But the most dangerous domino is confidence. A financial system is, at its core, a confidence game. You invest in a place because you believe it will be better tomorrow than it is today. When 50,000 of your best and brightest decide that the future is elsewhere, that confidence shatters. Let's examine the tech sector. The nation has had some massive successes. Xero, a cloud accounting software, is a global giant. Rocket Lab, a space launch company, is a marvel of engineering. But where is Rocket Lab headquartered now? The United States. Where is Xero listed? The Australian Securities Exchange. Even the success stories have to leave to survive. The business environment here is often described as _, _0_. But the reality is that it suffers from a lack of capital. Venture capital is scarce. If you have a brilliant idea in Auckland, you might get a little bit of seed funding, but when you need 50 million to scale up, the money just isn't there. So the founders depart, and they take the jobs with them. And here is the twist nobody saw coming. For years, the government assumed that the people leaving were just on their OE, the overseas experience. It's a rite of passage to go to London or Europe for 2 years, work in a pub, see the world, and then come home to settle down. Long-term planning relied on the assumption that they would always return. But the data shows a terrifying shift. They aren't coming back. The return rate is dropping. Why would they? If they return, they take a pay cut, their cost of living goes up, and they can't afford a home. The social contract that pulled people back, the promise of a good place to raise kids, has been broken. The schools are slipping in global rankings. The healthcare system is in crisis. The streets are feeling less safe, with crime rates becoming a major political issue. The paradise is fraying at the edges. Let's talk about the specific mechanics of the brain drain across the Tasman. because Canberra recently changed the rules in a way that was devastating for Wellington. For years, Kiwis in Oz were treated as second-class citizens. They could work, but they couldn't vote, they couldn't get student loans, and they couldn't get welfare. This acted as a bit of a barrier. It made people hesitate. But in 2023, the federal government there changed the pathway to citizenship. They made it significantly easier for their neighbors to become naturalized. That was the floodgate moment. The Prime Minister might as well have walked into downtown Auckland and handed out gold bars. The risk of moving vanished, the safety net was installed, and the exodus accelerated. According to Stats NZ, the net migration loss of citizens to the western neighbor in 2023 was one of the highest on record. We are talking about the depopulation of entire provincial towns worth of young people. So, what happens when a society loses its youth? It gets old, fast. The islands are facing a demographic time bomb. The ratio of workers to retirees is shrinking. Who is going to pay for the superannuation? Who is going to pay for the health care of the aging population? The people who should be paying those taxes are currently paying them to the Australian Tax Office. This creates a vicious cycle. The state needs more revenue to support the elderly, so they have to keep taxes high or cut services. High taxes and bad services drive more young people away. The tax base shrinks further. The services get worse. Rinse and repeat. And this is where it gets really interesting for anyone watching from the UK or Canada or even parts of Europe. This small nation is the canary in the coal mine. The problems faced here, property unaffordability, stagnant productivity, high migration reliance, are present in almost every Western market. Canada has a real estate bubble that makes this one look modest. The UK has a productivity crisis that has baffled economists for a decade. But Aotearoa is smaller, more isolated, and more fragile. It breaks faster. The country is now in a recession. GDP per capita has fallen for several consecutive quarters. That means the average person is getting poorer. The rock star era has left the building, and the roadies are packing up the gear. But is it over? Is this place destined to become a retirement village in the South Pacific? Not necessarily. The land still has incredible assets. It produces enough food to feed 40 million people. It has abundant renewable energy. It has a legal system that is free of corruption and a democracy that is stable. These are not small things in a volatile world. However, the fix requires something that has been missing for 20 years: political courage. To fix the system, the government would need to crash the property market. There is no polite way to say it. They would need to enact policies that drive values down by 30 or 40% to bring them back in line with wages. But doing that would wipe out the wealth of the voting majority, the baby boomers, and the older generation who vote in high numbers. It is political suicide. So instead, they tinker around the edges. They introduce a few subsidies here, a few tax tweaks there. They talk about affordable homes without ever defining what affordable means. Meanwhile, the planes keep taking off. Every day, flights depart from Auckland to Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. And on those flights sit the nurses who will treat patients overseas, the police who will patrol foreign streets, and the builders who will construct houses across the water. The tragedy of this story isn't that the nation is a bad place. It's that it is a wonderful place that has been mismanaged into mediocrity. It is a case study in what happens when a state prioritizes the passive wealth of property owners over the active ambition of its workers. When you make it impossible for young people to build a life, they don't riot. They don't burn down the parliament. They just leave. They check out. They vote with their feet. And the lesson for the rest of the world is stark. You cannot build a sustainable system on selling homes to each other. You cannot import prosperity through mass migration without infrastructure investment. And you cannot expect loyalty from a generation that you have priced out of existence. New Zealand is currently learning the hard way that a country is not just a piece of land with a flag. It is a deal. It is a contract between the generations. And right now, in the land of the long white cloud, that contract is in default. If you observe the trajectory of successful small nations, places like Singapore or Ireland or Switzerland, they all have one thing in common. They are obsessed with competitiveness. They know that because they are small, they have to be better. They have to be faster. They have to offer something the big guys can't. The Kiwi state forgot that. It rested on its laurels. It believed its own marketing. It thought that quote 3 was enough to pay the bills. But lifestyle doesn't pay the rent when it costs $700 a week and your paycheck is stagnant. There was a moment recently that perfectly encapsulated the absurdity of the situation. A news report showcased a young couple living across the Tasman. They were working in a supermarket, just stacking shelves. And they revealed that they were saving more money stacking shelves there than they were working as qualified professionals back home. When a supermarket shelf stacker in one jurisdiction has more disposable income than a teacher or a nurse in another, your economic model is broken. That is not a, quote, market fluctuation. That is a systemic failure. The government is trying to pivot. There are talks of cutting red tape, of encouraging foreign investment, of breaking up the supermarket duopoly. But these things take time, and time is the one thing the country is running out of. Because once a person leaves, once they set up a life in a new place, once their kids start school there, they rarely come back. The loss is permanent. The quote-unquote brain drain becomes a quote-unquote brain severance. What we are witnessing is the slow motion hollowing out of a nation. The scenery remains, the mountains are still majestic, the beaches are still pristine, but the engine room is empty. For the business leaders and policymakers watching this, the story is a warning. It shows how quickly a quote-unquote safe haven can turn into a trap. It demonstrates that high costs of living are not just an annoyance. They are a strategic vulnerability. If your workers cannot afford to live near their jobs, you don't have a business, you have a hobby. To the casual observer, the brochure image holds up. The sweeping drone shots still suggest a perfect sanctuary. But beneath the surface, a complex financial reality is unraveling. And for the young people watching this, the lesson is perhaps even more cynical. Loyalty to a homeland is a noble sentiment, but economic survival is a reality. The world is a marketplace of opportunities, and right now, this nation is pricing itself out of the market for its own citizens. The question isn't quote zero. The question is, given the math, given the accommodation costs, given the wages, why is anyone staying? And the answer to that usually comes down to family, to love, to a connection to the land. But even love has a price limit. And the current system is testing that limit every single day. As the sun rises over the Pacific, it illuminates a state at a crossroads. One path leads to a future as a hollowed-out resort for the global rich, serviced by a transient workforce. The other path requires a painful, radical restructuring of the entire system, a shattering of the property idol, a breakup of the monopolies, and a ruthless focus on productivity. Which path will they choose? History suggests that countries rarely choose the painful path until they have no other option. And here, the options are running out. It's a beautiful place, it really is, but you can't eat the scenery. Until the leadership figures out how to turn that beauty into a viable business model for the people who actually live there, the departure lounges at Auckland International Airport will remain the busiest places in town. If you found this analysis of the Kiwi market interesting, watch the next video. It goes even deeper into how Canada is falling into the exact same trap, but on a much larger scale.